All right, so this, as Pamela said, is like our conclusive talk. So before I go into my work and tell you about my project and the different direction it took me, just to give you some context, I want to say a couple of words about the field I came to identify myself with when I'm asked to pick one, which is science communication, which is probably relevant to many of your work, especially scientists. And there are many definitions. This is like a lengthy one from the National Academy of Sciences. But what I want to highlight is that what we're trying to do in this field at the moment is really develop an exchange between science and the public. So we're trying to move away from the old so-called deficit model that dominated the field for the past 20, 30 years, which assume that the more knowledge we put out there, the more people will learn about science. And it clearly didn't work. So we are trying to understand who is the public, essentially, why people engage with science, what do they want to know from scientists. And I know for us it's difficult to think about it. Of course, we care about our work, but if we really want to have this bidirectional exchange, it's important we think also about people's motivations and views and concerns. And this push in the field has led in the past couple of years to a whole proliferation of social science research and surveys, trying to understand exactly what Americans think of science and how they encounter science. They are all being collected in these very nice reports by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, if you're interested. And there are many interesting things emerging, but the main thing is really that so the public, in general, still trusts science and scientific institutions. They still like us for some reason. But there are huge divisions in what kind of people engage with science, especially along lines of age, race, education, and also geographical location. So we are, in general, doing a good job, but we are really failing on some specific publics. So that's why, really, in the field, we are trying to think of this general public in a more nuanced way and start to acknowledge that there are many different communities, again, with different backgrounds and different reasons to engage with science. And so our science communication should be tailored to this diversity. And yet, when it comes to the actual practice of science communication, how do we do it? Well, most of us scientists, I think we resort to the format we are most familiar with, which is giving a talk with a PowerPoint. If we have a bit more time, we may decide to write an article or even a book, or if we feel adventurous, we may go on Twitter. And I have nothing against any of these formats. I love Twitter. Please follow me. But the problem is that, as you can see, they all have something in common. They all rely very heavily on verbal communication. So we are not really diversifying our offer very much. So what can we do differently? How do we stand out in this landscape, which is so similar to each other, these formats? Well, there are many things we can do, of course. There are science festivals and museums. But today, I want to talk about the one I particularly chose, which is visual communication. As Pamela mentioned, I had a whole second career after my PhD as a comic artist, illustrator, working on several projects that try to communicate science visually. So I became very passionate about this field. And what I noticed straight away is that there is still a stigma against this kind of communication. And as historians of science and science technology scholars are pointing out, images, especially popular images like comics, remain an underprivileged means of communication. And the result is that people think maybe these things are easy and simpler to use. And this is a problem, I think, because they're not. And just as an example, how many of you have seen this picture earlier this month? Yeah, as I guess, most of the room. Because this picture, the first picture of a black hole, was posted probably millions of times in many, many different places and formats. So I think this is a clear example of the power of science, of visual communication in science, especially when it enters the public domain. We very often rely on pictures. But is it a good use of visual communication? Personally, I don't think so, because this picture was often posted without any context, without any explanation of how it was taken, what is this weird red halo around it. And again, and not the only one, as scholars like Maria Gigante points out in her book, often images of science are used to kind of awe and impress the public without really any sort of rhetorical framework around. And the result is that this may actually be counterproductive, because we may reinforce this idea, this division between the science and the public, by presenting science as something beautiful and mysterious, but that that the general public cannot possibly understand. That's why, personally, I prefer to see things like this. This is a comic by this online comic, Wandering Planet, that was posted right after the announcement of the black hole picture, and it may not have the same mystery and sense of sublime, but it takes this very complex subject and it really breaks it down into simple steps and explains how the picture was taken and why it's important. And this is nothing new. This has been happening for a while now. Comics about science started online with these fun strips, these classic web comics, probably many of you have seen, and quickly evolved into more long-form graphic novels about science and scientists, to arrive more recently even on the most respected academic journals, like Science and Nature. They both published online comics in 2015. And even academic publishers now publish graphic novels or graphic essays as trade books. And if you want more examples, I have many of these. Part of what I've been doing is also collecting all this material on this website, cartoonscience.org, to give more visibility to this emerging field. But unfortunately, while science comics are really booming as a field, our understanding, our research about them is lagging behind. And this was the motivation behind my project. I really wanted to understand, like, why should we use comics and what are comics doing in science communication. And I started as, I guess, any PhD student would start with looking for empirical studies, so doing a review of existing studies. Needless to say, I didn't find many, and the ones that exist are very diverse in terms of setting and scope, and many of them don't have a control, so they're not really the best evidence. But from what we know so far, it looks like comics may be equivalent to textbooks on learning and knowledge acquisition, but importantly, they may improve engagement of readers. And as you see, they're compared to textbooks because most of them, basically all of them, were done in the classroom, which is interesting, but as I mentioned earlier, there's really a distinction between science education, even informal science education, and science communication. The goal here is not really to educate the public, but engage them, bring them in the conversation. So the first thing I wanted to do is to see if this preliminary evidence from classroom studies replicates on the general public. So what I did was to write and illustrate these short stories. The first one was about the research of Kimberly Noble at Teachers College. She's right here, the character in my comic in real life. And I'm not going to go into the detail, but as you can see, it's like a short story. And the key thing is that it worked both as a text and as a comic article. So I wanted something that could be comparable. Because what I wanted to do was recruit participants online on Amazon Mechanical Turk and present them with either the comic version or the text version of the article, and measure things like knowledge and engagement. And then to do within participant comparison, I also I presented each participant with a comic and a text article So I used the other articles. We tested so far 3 different articles, all kind of equivalent in length, but as you can see, different topics. So one is about the effect of inequality on brain development. One is about sleeping sickness, so parasitology. And the latest one is about new immunotherapy technique. And the results so far, they kind of confirm what we see in the class. So there was no significant difference on knowledge, on learning. This was not surprising for me. I know Barbara still wants to see some effect on this. But what I'm really looking for is not learning, is engagement. And on engagement, again, similar to what we see in the classroom, comics have a small but significant effect. So they can, participants rate them as more enjoyable and more interesting. So the kind of question, this is a composite measure of Likert scales. You see 5-point Likert scales. Essentially, we are asking questions like this. And as you can see, comics are consistently rated more positively than text on this kind of questions. So this was encouraging, but kind of confusing because, as you've seen, some comics worked better than others. And so I started to think, okay, why exactly does some have an effect and some don't? So I started to look more into the content of the comics. And as you can see, they're quite different. For example, this last one I did about immunotherapy uses some of the visual language of diagrams. So you can see like side-by-side comparisons. You can see the cycle of immunotherapy. So I started to realize that within the comic format, of course, there are many different things we can do. And it's going to be very hard to test these things empirically. So beyond the empirical study, I started to ask myself, okay, if there are any effects of comics on readers, what components of comics mediate these effects? And this is where my research started to get more complicated and take different directions. Because I went in, I think, with this, maybe naively, with this very straightforward approach of applying the methods I learned in science to this new domain, visual narratives. But then halfway through, I started to realize there were many other things I didn't consider. There are many other disciplines which ask similar questions but have slightly different goals. And this was the beauty of being in the PSSN program, because it really allowed me the flexibility to just take a walk around these other disciplines. And so my path ended up being something more like that, which is maybe less efficient, but definitely more enjoyable for me. And just to give you a taste of the other things I've done, so I started working a lot with experts in data visualization and information design on this concept of data comics. So in this case, we are not looking at comics just as text plus picture, which is a very, I guess, oversimplified way to look at comics. But following the definition of comic scholars like Scott McCloud, we are really focusing on the sequential nature of comics. So many scholars, when they try to define comics, they came up with convoluted definitions like this that essentially highlight the fact that comics are not just one panel, but really a sequence of panels, a composition of many panels. And for example, Nick Souzanis, who's an education scholar and did his whole PhD about comics as a tool for education, points out that comics have this dual nature. So they can be read sequentially, like text. So in this case, maybe comics are comparable to text, one panel after another. But in a comic, each panel also modifies the meaning of the panels around them and can create these very complex nonlinear interactions on a page, which I think they're interesting because when it comes to science, we often have to explain these nonlinear complex dynamics. So what we did with this group of data visualization scholars is to try to map out the design space of what comics can do in terms of panel layout. So as you can see, from the most linear to the completely non-linear arrangements. And we also compared comics with what you can think of as their close cousins, infographics. So in this study that we are going to present actually next week at the Computer-Human Interaction Conference, we compared the traditional infographic, like this bubble chart about worldwide carbon emissions, to this comic translation I made, in which, as you can see, similar to the text experiments, the content is exactly the same. So I didn't add or remove any text. We just used the comic layout to guide the reader through the information, and also, as you can see, what I really like to do is add these little visual devices that give, I think, a more embodied, more natural understanding of this abstract data. So in this case, we turn this per capita carbon emission data into these hot air balloons that are bigger or smaller, depending how much people consume in a country. And the results, I don't have time to show them, but they're essentially very similar. Like, there is no effect on memory, but people stopped more often, and they reported to prefer the comics, which from a science communication perspective, I think, is exactly what we want, engage these occasional readers. And so as you can see, you can also call it a metaphor, and that's the other topic I became really interested in and spent a lot of time exploring, which, as some of you probably know, it's another huge field of research, especially philosophers and historians of science have already shown how metaphors play a crucial role in scientific process and discovery, especially when we first approach intangible domains. So at the core of many models or theories were these metaphors, often visual metaphors or embodied metaphors. And so what I did in this case is really just take all this research and summarize it into an article, which is a graphic article. It's my first peer-reviewed comics, a major achievement, personal achievement for me. And it's this short comic kind of summarizing this whole research. And as you can see, it's published on the Comics Grid, which is a journal of comic scholarship. So what I'm really trying to do here is really not kind of make a new argument, but make all this research accessible to a new community. So comic scholars or science communicators that probably have never read Lakoff and Johnson or Gentner studies. But I think it's very relevant because comics use metaphors all the time, especially when it comes to scientific or medical subjects. These are some examples from graphic medicine, which is a kind of related field. So these are comics about medicine, often written by patients to explain their subjective experience. And they often use metaphors to visualize these invisible things like their mental state in a bipolar disorder or symptoms that are not visible to families or doctors, like numbness, which is very difficult to explain with words. And of course, we do this also in science comics. These are examples from my own comics, the one I actually did for my experiment. You can see how in the comic about inequality and brain development, I represented socioeconomic status as this mountain that children physically have to climb during their life. Or in the one about immunotherapy, we essentially turned the whole story into the story of these immune cells, these T cells. So you can really use metaphors to turn somehow cold and abstract subject into a more narrative story. So really at the end of my project, essentially what I did, I moved away from this view of comics as like one field or one genre. I started to look at comics as a combination of many different elements. None of which is unique to comics, but I think comics can combine them in a very unique way. And especially when it comes to science communication, they can be really useful, especially I hope to reach all those underserved communities, which maybe are not, again, engaging with text or articles or other science communication formats. And along these lines, another thing I've started to do is a lot of workshops and kind of training events, both for scientists and non-scientists, where I essentially guide them through all these different techniques. And this probably was the most transformative experience for me during these 3 years, because I realized that what I always consider my strange little hobby, comics, to be something that actually has value, is like an actual skill, because scientists often need to communicate with the broader audience, and we often use visuals, but we are not trained in visual communication. So I think we have a lot to learn from all these other fields and domains that already looked at what's the best way to communicate things visually. So I'm personally planning to do more and more of this in the future. I think I see myself less and less as a researcher and more as a translator of research. So taking all this research in psychology and educational and studies and cognitive neuroscience and turn into something that science communicator practitioners can actually use in their everyday work. And to conclude, I just want to say a couple of words about interdisciplinarity, because it's a kind of tradition that started last year with the first cohort, and we all been thinking about this word for 3 years. So personally, the way I see it, and I'm going to show it through a visual metaphor, of course. So if we think of different disciplines as different ivory towers or silos or whatever you want to call them, these things that isolate us. The way interdisciplinarity has been done mostly so far, I think it looks like this. Essentially trying to build a bridge, a connection between these different disciplines. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's like a valuable approach. The main problem I see is that it still relies very heavily on the support of our original disciplines. And also, as you can see, the risk is that it remains very detached from the outside world and other people. So we risk to become equally difficult to understand from original disciplines and from the general public, whatever the general public is. So what I would like to see, what I encourage interdisciplinary scholars to do, is to combine this maybe with a more applied approach, in which we not only engage with different disciplines, but also build a space for other people outside of academia to come and engage and interact with our work. Because I feel like it's really a missed opportunity. We already made the first step of getting outside of our ivory tower, our bubble. It wouldn't, I think we put such an ideal position to open up and seek other source of support and feedback. And yeah, that's my hope for the future. That's the end of my talk. I want to thank, of course, all the Center for Science and Society and all the Presidential Scholars and my mentors, Barbara, who's here, and Marguerite, who couldn't be here, but they both helped me a lot in this work and supported me all the time. And yeah, if you want to see more science comics, please follow me online. And if you have any other question about my project, I think we have still 5 minutes now. Thank you.